Before cinematic became a buzzword and cover-based shooters clogged every press conference sizzle reel, there was Uncharted: Drake's Fortune. Released in 2007, this was Naughty Dog's first big swing on the PlayStation 3, and it landed with both hands firmly gripping the pulpy, popcorn-soaked torch left behind by Indiana Jones and Tomb Raider. But Uncharted wasn't just chasing adventure tropes, it was doing something bolder, treating video game characters like actual people, with voices, chemistry, and a sense of rhythm that had more in common with film than game design. It's easy to forget just how rare that was in 2007. This was the same year Kane and Lynch Dead Men launched with all the subtlety of a cinder block to the jaw. Mass Effect had conversations, sure, but not like this. Drake's Fortune didn't just give its leads dialogue, it gave them repartee. Nathan Drake wasn't an everyman because the script told us so. He was an everyman because Nolan North made him feel like someone who'd lose his keys before he found El Dorado. Elena wasn't just a love interest. Sully wasn't just a mentor. They were a trio that felt lived in, even when the world around them was filled with booby traps and ancient curses. But character work alone doesn't carry a game, and Uncharted had to prove it could play as well as it could talk. Its jungle-covered ruins, Gears-like combat, and cinematic set pieces were all part of a new formula, one that would go on to become PlayStation's signature flavor. And while Drake's Fortune may be a bit stiff by today's standards, it's a blueprint worth revisiting, not just for what it introduced, but for how well it framed Naughty Dog's future. This retrospective aims to dig into the bedrock of Uncharted's legacy, and ultimately zero in on what made these characters endure. Because Drake's Fortune wasn't just the start of a series, it was the moment character-driven storytelling and action games found its next-gen footing. When Naughty Dog began working on Uncharted: Drake's Fortune, it was doing so as a studio in transition, both technically and creatively. This was the team that had made its name on mascot platformers like Crash Bandicoot and Jak and Daxter, games that defined entire console generations for Sony. But by the mid-2000s, it was clear that the landscape was shifting. The PlayStation 3 was on the horizon, and with it came expectations of cinematic presentation, realistic visuals, and narrative ambition. Naughty Dog wasn't just changing projects, it was changing identity. Development on Uncharted began around 2005 under the codename Project Big. Early concepts reportedly included more traditional supernatural elements and stylized visuals, closer in tone to Jak than Indiana Jones, but that direction didn't survive contact with the PlayStation 3's hardware ambitions, or Sony's. The goal was clear: deliver a game that could stand as a first-party showcase, not just for graphical fidelity, but for emotional storytelling. With this in mind, Naughty Dog pivoted hard into grounded, human-focused action. The exaggerated character designs and whimsical tone of their past work were replaced by motion capture, character-driven scripts, and a grounded art style. It was a creative reset, bold, risky, and far from guaranteed. What complicated this shift was a technical foundation. Naughty Dog didn't have access to third-party engines like Unreal, nor did they want to license one. They built their Uncharted engine from the ground up, a decision that cost time, strained resources, and pushed the studio's pipeline to its limits. Developing for the PlayStation 3's notoriously convoluted cell processor was already a challenge, but doing so with a brand new IP, new rendering pipeline, and a storytelling structure that relied on full motion capture performances, that was Uncharted territory. Haha, get it? Much of that risk was, however, mitigated by the casting. Bringing on Nolan North as Nathan Drake was one of the studio's most impactful decisions. His performance wasn't just voice acting, it was performance capture in a way few games had meaningfully attempted at the time. The interplay between North, Emily Rose as Elena, and Richard McGonagall as Sully was captured together on a stage using mocap suits and full body blocking. That cohesion bled into every interaction. Unlike the disconnected, stitched together dialogue of most contemporary games, Uncharted's conversations had timing, texture, and chemistry. It wasn't just a technology, it was the directional intent behind it. The game heavily drew inspiration from pulp adventure cinema, Indiana Jones, The Mummy, and National Treasure, but it also borrowed from the structural clarity of modern shooters like Resident Evil 4 and Gears of War. The result was a genre fusion: platforming, cover-based combat, environmental puzzles, and high-energy set pieces all under one roof. The tone was breezy, the pacing tight, and the emphasis on character made it feel unlike anything else on the market. Drake's Fortune may look modest today compared to its sequels, but in 2007 it was a technical statement piece. The real-time cutscenes, seamless transitions between gameplay and cinematics, and lush jungle environments were a direct response to critics who claimed the PS3 was underpowered or overpriced. Sony needed a first-party hit that screamed next-gen, and Naughty Dog delivered. Just not in the loud, bombastic way other games did. Drake's Fortune was sleek, character-focused, and modern in a way that made everything before it feel suddenly dated. And while it wouldn't become a cultural juggernaut until Among Thieves 2 years later, Uncharted Drake's Fortune laid the blueprint. It was the moment Naughty Dog stopped being a mascot studio and became one of the defining cinematic storytellers in the medium. When Drake's Fortune debuted in 2007, it was more than a new franchise. It was a tech demo with a pulse. This was one of the first PlayStation 3 titles that genuinely looked like it couldn't have existed on the previous generation. While competitors were still fumbling through the grey and brown Warzone aesthetic of early 7th gen design, Uncharted went in the opposite direction. Lush jungle canopies, golden sun-drenched ruins, reflective water physics, and richly animated characters. It wasn't just about fidelity, it was about tone. The island setting was a smart choice, and not just for gameplay. Visually, it gave Naughty Dog room to show off the PS3's lighting and particle systems. Dense foliage cast dynamic shadows, water shimmered, rippled, and soaked through fabric. Drake's shirt looked darker when wet, dirtied realistically when rolling through the mud, and gradually dried as he moved through the environment. These might seem trivial now, but in 2007, they were subtle revolutions, evidence of a team aiming to make characters feel like tangible beings within tactile spaces. More impressive perhaps was the character animation. Thanks to Naughty Dog's use of full body performance capture, facial expressions in the game felt less like animated masks and more like glimpses into a real performance. Eyes darted, brows furrowed, mouths moved with syncopated realism. It wasn't flawless, lip syncing had its rough moments, and some facial rigs still floated in the uncanny valley. But it was among the most advanced character rendering of its time. It's not a stretch to say that Uncharted was a precursor to the performance-driven benchmarks that studios like Naughty Dog, Quantic Dream, and later Santa Monica Studio would aim for in the following decade. Environmental design too was doing more than just looking good, it was communicating context. The ruins felt ancient, overgrown and semi-functional. The scale of the environments was carefully chosen, often compressing exploration corridors into wide-angle views that still gave the illusion of openness. Vistas were composed with painterly balance. A broken stone bridge would lead your eye to a waterfall, which would lead to a hidden ledge, which would, of course, lead to combat. The game wasn't open world, but it didn't need to be. It knew how to frame its space for maximum visual storytelling. However, not all aspects aged as gracefully. Texture resolution is often flat by modern standards, and there's a uniform sheen across surfaces that betrays the era's over-reliance on bloom and specular lighting. Enemy models in particular don't get the same attention as the main cast, and you'll see plenty of recycled faces and outfits among the pirate henchmen. But even here, Uncharted sidesteps fatigue with smart use of animation blending and reactive death physics, keeping firefights visually dynamic even when the models themselves are limited. Compared to other 2007 releases like Assassin's Creed, Mass Effect or Call of Duty 4, Drake's Fortune was aiming for something very different. It wasn't chasing scale, realism, or historical fidelity. It was chasing cinematic presentation. And that focus paid off. The game looked like a movie without sacrificing clarity, and it did so without drowning the scene in visual clutter or bloom-induced haze. Drake's Fortune's visuals weren't about showing off, they were about supporting performance. Every camera angle, every lighting cue, every animation choice was designed to reinforce the story being told. And while its sequels would go on to raise the technical ceiling dramatically, Drake's Fortune earns its place as the game that taught a generation of developers how to use visuals in service of character. If Uncharted Drake's Fortune was the moment Naughty Dog found its cinematic voice visually, it was also the game where they discovered just how powerful sound could be as a storytelling tool. From Greg Edmonson's sweeping score to the punch of gunfire and the rustle of bushes, every element of the game's sound design is in service of immersion. It doesn't just accompany the action, it grounds it. Let's start with the obvious, the voice acting. In 2007, this wasn't just good for a video game, this was industry defining. Nolan North's performance as Nathan Drake is now a matter of historical record, but at the time, it felt like a revolution. His delivery was casual, clipped, and natural in a way that didn't feel pre-recorded or filtered through layers of direction. His chemistry with Emily Rose's Elena and Richard McGonagall's Sully wasn't manufactured, it was captured, with all three actors often recording together on set. This gave their conversations a rhythm, a spontaneity that made them feel lived in.
When he returned to England, Queen Elizabeth confiscated all his charts and logbooks, including this one, and then swore the entire crew to secrecy.
Yeah.
See, when Drake discovered something on that voyage, Sully, something so secret and so valuable, they couldn't risk it getting out.
All right, Nate, just pretend for a minute that I don't really care about any of that stuff and cut to the chase, would you?
A man only interested in the climax. You must be a real hit with the ladies.
Never had any complaints.
You believe these characters knew each other, because their voices told you so before the writing even had to. The voice direction was also careful not to overplay itself. Even during high tension moments, Drake never fell into the melodramatic screaming that plagued so many contemporaries. His quips and panicked remarks were reactive, human, and crucially timed to gameplay. A missed jump just earned a quick whoa. A close call with gunfire prompted muttered sarcasm. These weren't just one-liners, they were contextual characterizations. Sound effects carried equal weight. Guns had heft, pistol shots cracked, shotguns thudded. Grenades popped with a sharp, controlled echo. Every firearm had its own audio identity, and that identity fed directly into how satisfying they felt to use. Combined with clean reloading sounds and tight enemy hit reactions, the gunplay had a clarity and weight that made even simple shootouts feel satisfying. Environmental audio wasn't no slouch either. Jungle environments buzzed with insect life, ruins groaned under the pressure of age, waterfalls didn't just look good, they roared. And subtle touches were everywhere. Drake's boots squelching in the mud, shifting gravel underfoot in crypt chambers, or the distant echo of waves breaking against forgotten coastlines. There's restraint here too. The mix never overwhelms the action, it supports it, letting score and ambient sounds fade into the background when character moments take center stage. Speaking of score, Greg Edmonson's music deserves more credit than it usually gets. The Uncharted theme, brassy, adventurous, and subtly melancholic, feels like a deliberate echo of John Williams' work on Indiana Jones, but without leaning into parody. It's bold enough to elevate the big set pieces, yet malleable enough to support quieter, exploratory sequences. Importantly, the game knows when not to play music at all. Some moments are left to breathe, carried only by ambient sound or the tension of silence, giving scenes more dramatic weight than the average shooter of its time could muster. More than anything, the audio in Uncharted Drake's Fortune feels holistic. Every piece of sound, whether it's a sarcastic remark, a bullet ricochet, or a sweeping orchestral cue, feeds into the atmosphere. It's not just about sounding good, it's about building presence, about placing you in the middle of a collapsing ruin, a frantic shootout, or a quiet moment between two characters unsure of what comes next. In the years that followed, this approach would become industry standard, especially for big budget single player titles. But in 2007, Uncharted didn't just sound better than most of its peers, it sounded like it belonged in a different medium entirely. For all the cinematic polish and narrative charm, Uncharted Drake's Fortune is, at its core, still a game about two things, shooting and climbing, and for a first entry in a franchise still finding its footing, it pulls off both with a surprising degree of confidence. But while the moment-to-moment flow is serviceable and often entertaining, it's also where some of the game's age shows most clearly. Let's start with the combat. Drake's Fortune adopted a cover-based third-person shooting system, clearly inspired by the then-recent Gears of War, but filtered through a more agile, less armor-clad lens. Drake snaps to cover, leans out to shoot, and ducks back to reload. Nothing revolutionary by modern standards, but at the time it was still a relatively fresh mechanic for console audiences. Gunplay is snappy, if a little stiff. Pistol shots have a satisfying crack. The AK-47 kicks just enough to feel unstable. Grenades have an arcing reticle system that works better than it looks. And, while aiming lacks the precision of later entries, the feedback loop is intact. You shoot, enemies stagger, the camera pulls just enough to let you know you landed something meaningful. What Uncharted does especially well, even in its earliest form, is weaving combat into its narrative rhythm. You're rarely dropped into arena after arena without some narrative justification, and the encounters escalate in a way that mirrors the tension of the story. It's not just fight because it's time to fight, it's fight because you're surrounded, or trapped, or chasing something important. That said, the repetition becomes more apparent as the game goes on. Enemy variety is minimal, mostly pirates and mercenaries with increasingly bigger guns. And late game fights often lean too heavily into artificial difficulty via an over-reliance on seemingly infinite wave spawns. It's not broken, just overused. A tighter encounter design philosophy would be embraced in later entries, but here the seams occasionally show. On the flip side is exploration and traversal, and this is where Uncharted first showed signs of Naughty Dog's future strengths. Climbing sequences, while simple, are well paced and often framed with striking cinematography. The controls are basic: jump, shimmy, grab. but the game's level design sells the illusion of verticality. Handholds are highlighted just enough to guide the player without over signposting, and many platforming sequences function more like interactive set pieces than true puzzles. Still, there's a rhythm to the movement that feels good, and the game is careful not to overextend these sequences. They break up combats, give the story time to breathe, and occasionally reward exploration with collectible treasures scattered throughout the world. Puzzles serve a similar purpose. They're light, rarely demanding, but well integrated into the pacing. Most involve rotating statues, flipping switches, or matching journal clues to ancient mechanisms. It's more about giving the player a break than stumping them, and in that regard, they do their job. The puzzles never overstay their welcome, and they help sell the fantasy of uncovering a lost civilization without dragging the momentum to a halt. That fantasy is also supported by the game's commitment to environmental interaction. Drake isn't just a vessel for gunfire. He stumbles, reacts, slides and vaults with believable weight. Get too close to a ledge during a firefight and he'll instinctively duck. Move through water and you'll hear the slosh. This attention to physicality wasn't just polish, it was part of the game's design ethos, making Drake feel like a real person in a tangible world. And even when the mechanics themselves are simple, that illusion often carries the player further than expected. One area that does however falter is enemy AI. Foes are aggressive and competent enough to keep you moving. They'll flank, take cover and lob grenades, but their patterns become predictable quickly, and the lack of unique enemy types or tactical variety can make extended shootouts feel mechanical. Boss encounters are similarly sparse, with the game opting for cinematic climaxes rather than mechanically distinct showdowns. But if Drake's Fortune's gameplay isn't always deep, it's almost always well framed. It knows how to pace itself. It knows when to pull back and when to lean in, and it understands that gameplay, even when simple, can feel engaging when it's contextualized by strong art direction, audio, and narrative momentum. Drake's Fortune didn't reinvent the action-adventure wheel, but it smoothed it out, polished it, and painted it gold. It offered a blueprint, simple mechanics, tightly directed levels, and just enough cinematic flair to make you forget how often you were doing the same thing. Later entries would refine, expand, and deconstruct that formula, but this is where it all started, and it started pretty damn strong. If there's one thing Drake's Fortune nails straight out of the gate, it's tone. This isn't a tale of world-ending doom or tortured morality. It's a treasure hunt, through and through. One with ancient maps, half-buried tombs, double crosses, and lost civilizations. It's pulp, but it's smart pulp. The game takes a familiar adventure framework and injects it with something rare in 2007. Personality. There are stakes, sure, but the real draw is watching a wisecracking fortune hunter talk his way into trouble and somehow shoot his way back out with half a grin still intact. The game opens with Nathan Drake, treasure hunter, descendant of famed explorer Sir Francis Drake, recovering a coffin from the ocean floor. Inside isn't a corpse, but a clue, a diary that holds the way to El Dorado, the fabled city of gold.
El goddamn Dorado.
Alongside him is Elena Fisher, a journalist filming a documentary about the expedition, and soon after, Victor Sully Sullivan, Nate's cigar-shopping mentor and partner in scheming. Naturally, things go sideways almost immediately. Pirates attack, Sully's old debts come back to haunt him, and before long, the trio is swept into a full-blown chase across a forgotten island where El Dorado was supposedly hidden and heavily protected. Along the way, Drake and Elena are separated from Sully, encounter rival treasure hunters, and uncover increasingly grim signs that El Dorado may not be a golden city at all, but something far darker. The main antagonists are Gabriel Roman, a ruthless financier funding his own expedition, and his enforcer Atok Navarro, whose role becomes more pronounced as the story unfolds. They're after the same thing Drake is, but with a lot more muscle and a lot less charm, as the island's secrets are unearthed, including the corpse of Francis Drake and a series of World War II era ruins. It becomes clear that El Dorado isn't a treasure, but a curse. A sarcophagus-like idol that infects those who interact with it, turning them into feral, mindless husks. After surviving zombie-like mutants called Descendants, Drake finally confronts Roman, who is betrayed by Navarro and then tries to escape with the idol. The final confrontation takes place aboard a cargo ship, ending with a fistfight and a final dramatic one-liner.
Adios, asshole.
With Navarro defeated and the cursed statue sunk to the bottom of the sea, Nate and Elena reunite with Sully and sail off into the sunset. Nathan Drake is the centerpiece, and what makes him work is that he's not a superhero. He trips, he bleeds, he complains. He runs his mouth when he should shut it, but he's also likable in a way that's hard to fake. Much of this comes down to Nolan North's performance, which walks a fine line between charm and smugness without tipping into either too far. Drake isn't just a vessel for the player, he's a full-fledged personality. which was still a novelty in the shooter-heavy landscape of 2007. His relationship with Elena is what gives the game its emotional backbone. Elena isn't a damsel or a hanger-on. She's smart, capable, and often one step ahead of Drake, even when she doesn't have the same combat chops. Their dynamic is built on banter, tension, and mutual respect, with just enough spark to sell the romantic undertones without shoving them down the player's throat. You don't need a cutscene to tell you they like each other. The way they talk tells you everything. Then there's Sully, who might have walked straight out of a 1940s pulp serial but brings a surprising amount of heart to the table. As the gruff mentor figure, he's there to crack wise, talk shop, and occasionally bail Drake out of bad situations. But there's genuine affection underneath the sarcasm. And when he's seemingly killed off in the first hour of the game, despite barely knowing him at this point, you still feel bad about it, because Drake does too. He's not just a sidekick, he's family, and Naughty Dog wisely leaves enough space for that bond to grow organically between firefights. Then there's Eddie Raja, Nate's rival and the game's most memorable wildcard. He's not the smartest villain or the most threatening, but he is the most fun, swaggering through scenes like he owns the damn place. A former associate of Drake's turned opportunistic mercenary, Eddie plays the role of comic foil to near perfection. He's bombastic, short-tempered, and utterly convinced of his own importance, even when everything around him is falling apart. On the villain side, Gabriel Roman and Atok Navarro are effective, if not exactly deep. Roman plays a classic old-world villain, greedy, refined, and surrounded by hired guns. He works well as a looming threat but doesn't get much room to evolve before being unceremoniously sidelined by Navarro. Navarro, on the other hand, is a bit more interesting. He plays the part of the loyal enforcer right up until the end, only to reveal himself as the real mastermind. It's a standard heel turn, but it's executed with enough menace to make the final confrontation land. He's not memorable because of who he is. He's memorable because of how efficiently he unseats the man above him. The real antagonist, however, is El Dorado itself. The cursed idol doesn't speak, it doesn't move, and yet it drives the plot, reshapes characters, and casts a long shadow over every decision made. It's a classic twist, the treasure that turns out to be a threat, and it's executed with restraint. No supernatural exposition dumps, no end-of-the-world stakes. Yet. Just a slow, creeping sense that the past is poisonous and the dead should probably stay buried. What makes Uncharted's story work isn't that it's complex, it's that it's confidently told, the pacing is tight, the dialogue crackles. The characters feel human even when the world around them is supernatural. And most importantly, the game knows when to pull back. There's silence, there's downtime, there's space for personality to breathe between the shootouts. For a game that was trying to define the new era of cinematic storytelling, Drake's Fortune doesn't overplay its hand. It sets the tone, builds the foundation, and leaves just enough mystery to keep you leaning forward. When Uncharted Drake's Fortune landed in November 2007, it arrived onto a console cycle still finding its identity. The PlayStation 3 had stumbled out of the gate with a high price tag and a lack of compelling exclusives, while the Xbox 360 had already pulled ahead with a full year's head start, and heavy hitters like Gears of War and Bioshock. So when Uncharted hit the shelves, it wasn't just a new IP, it was a test case. Could Sony's first-party studios keep pace with the rising tide of prestige shooters, cinematic experiences, and next-gen expectations? The short answer was yes, but not without caveats. Critically, Drake's Fortune was warmly received. Reviewers praised its presentation, voice acting, and cinematic flair with near-universal consistency. IGN called it a triumph of storytelling and character work, while GameSpot highlighted its Indiana Jones meets Tomb Raider structure as a winning formula. The game earned aggregate scores in the mid to high 80s, with many singling it out as one of the PS3's first truly next-gen feeling exclusives. Not because it had the biggest explosions or the most guns, but because it felt authored. It had pacing, it had personality, it had characters that sounded like they weren't reading cue cards underwater. Of course, not every note was glowing. Combat, particularly its repetitive shootouts and limited enemy variety, came under fire. Some critics pointed to the bullet-spongy nature of later encounters, especially as wave-based design began to wear thin by the final third. Others felt the platforming, while fluid and well-animated, lacked through mechanical depth, and the puzzles, while serviceable, were rarely more than speed bumps. But even where it faltered, Uncharted rarely stumbled hard enough to damage its reputation. If anything, its shortcomings were viewed as the growing pains of a studio working outside its established comfort zone. Naughty Dog wasn't just shifting genres, they were learning how to build a prestige narrative framework around interactive systems, and that learning curve was visible but forgivable. Perhaps more importantly, Uncharted offered something intangible that critics latched onto: charm. It wasn't grim, it wasn't self-serious, it wasn't about moral choices or branching dialogue trees. It was about three people solving puzzles, cracking jokes, and getting in over their heads for a shot at something big. Drake's Fortune stood out precisely because it wasn't trying to redefine the genre. It just wanted to tell a damn good adventure story. Commercially, it was a slow burn. The game didn't set sales records out of the gate, but it performed steadily, buoyed by word of mouth and the growing recognition of Naughty Dog as a narrative powerhouse. Over time, Uncharted became a system seller, not because of raw numbers, but because it showcased what PlayStation exclusives could feel like: polished, cinematic, and character-driven. Today, Drake's Fortune is remembered less as a standalone classic and more as the spark that lit the fuse. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't the best in the series, but it redefined expectations for what a first-party action game could aim for, and in doing so, it helped set the tone, not just for the PS3 era, but for Sony's entire first-party philosophy going forward. It's easy to look back on Drake's Fortune and forget just how bold it was at the time, not because it reinvented action mechanics or blew minds with revolutionary design, but because it did something much harder. It made characters the selling points. In an era where most protagonists were either voiceless avatars or gravel-voiced soldiers, Uncharted introduced someone who cracked jokes, missed jumps, and bled like a real person. Nathan Drake wasn't iconic out of the gate, but he was human, and that distinction carried weight. The game didn't just establish a franchise, it set a tone that would echo across the next 2 console generations. Sony's eventual dominance in the prestige single-player space. This is where that blueprint started. You can draw a direct line from Drake's Fortune to The Last of Us, Horizon Zero Dawn, Ghost of Tsushima, and beyond. The cinematic presentation, the clean UI, the grounded writing, it all took root here. For Naughty Dog, this was the moment they graduated from that mascot studio to the industry's leading voice in narrative action games. But the legacy isn't without its asterisks. Mechanically, Drake's Fortune feels modest today. Its combat system, so fresh in 2007, has long since been eclipsed by its own sequels. Its puzzles are breezy, its shooting a bit floaty, and its encounter design occasionally overindulgent. But Drake's Fortune remains the place where it all started, raw, earnest, and brimming with potential. The release of Uncharted Drake's Fortune Remastered on the PlayStation 4 via the Nathan Drake Collection helped solidify that legacy for a new generation. With improved textures, better lighting, higher frame rates, and some subtle control tweaks, the remaster polished away some of the roughest edges without losing the charm that made the original work. It didn't retroactively solve the game's repetition or mechanical simplicity, but it made the experience smoother, faster, and easier to revisit. For many players, this was their first exposure to the series, and in that context, the remaster did its job beautifully. And that's really the legacy of Uncharted Drake's Fortune. It's not the franchise's best game, it's not even the most important narratively, but it is the foundation. And the strength of that foundation is still evident today. It introduced characters we still care about, systems we'd see refined, and a philosophy of storytelling that would define an entire platform. Uncharted didn't arrive with a bang, it arrived with a grin, a pistol, and a sarcastic quip. Just enough to leave a mark. And in the end, that was more than enough. It knew what kind of story it wanted to tell. It knew who its characters were, and it delivered those things with a level of polish and charm that few games in 2007 could match. It wasn't about innovation, it was about execution. This was a game that proved cinematic storytelling didn't have to come at the cost of interactivity, that characters could matter as much as combat, that a smirk and a stumble could sell a moment better than a cutscene ever could. And yes, it had its clunky shootouts and slightly too long waves of pirates, but when you think back on Drake's Fortune, that's not what you remember. You remember Drake reaching for a ledge that just gave way. You remember Elena holding a camera while dodging gunfire. And you remember Sully somehow surviving things that would kill a lesser man twice over. In many ways, Drake's Fortune feels like the start of modern PlayStation storytelling. It was messy, it was earnest, and it worked. It didn't need to redefine the medium, it just needed to show that characters could live in it. And from that one sunken coffin in the middle of the ocean, a legacy was born. So, thanks for watching to the end of this video. If you enjoyed, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe, as I have 286 more games to cover between now and the inevitable heat death of the universe. Follow me on Twitter and join the Discord. I've been playing around with the idea of streaming again, and I think I'd like to pick that back up either this weekend or the next. So stay on the lookout for that if you want to hang out as I play through this gem of a game on crushing difficulty. And lastly, I know I said the next video would have been Borderlands 3, but the script got a little longer than I expected, and I didn't want it to be 2 months before I uploaded something again. So, as always, I've been Xeniverse, and I'll see you all in the next video.